Hello and welcome to November's Breaking Barriers LinkedIn Live. I'm Rachel Schofield, Senior Facilitator at Shape Talent, and I am delighted to be joined today by, I was going to say underneath me, as maybe it appears different on your screen, but by Dr. Priscila Pereira, our Director of Research and Innovation here at Shape Talent. Good morning, Priscila.
Good morning.
And also the brilliant Sharon Peake, our founder and CEO. Hi, Sharon.
Hello, nice to be here.
Do let us know where you're joining from and tell us a little bit about you. We always feel like we introduce ourselves, and out there are loads of interesting people, and we would love to know about you. So do use the chat, say hello, tell us where you're joining from today. But it's a special session. We have a treat for you today because you are getting an early look at our brand new third edition of the 3 Barriers to Women's Progression. This is our report, which is officially launching today and essentially builds on work that we at Shape Talent have been doing since 2019. If I take you back in time, the original ambition of the 3 Barriers to Women's Progression report was to shine a light, a really specific, clear light on the systemic barriers holding women back and provide a clear framework for organisations as to how to respond to that and what to do as a result. And since then, Shape Talent's model has been validated with over 7,500 women across Europe, then expanded with a broader global lens. Look, Sharon and Priscila nodding furiously here. And this edition introduces a really strong intersectional perspective. So it's a bit different, showing how barriers compound across race and age and disability and sexuality. So that is what we are diving into with you today. You get the first exclusive look. And why is this still important? Well, just for context, one statistic that we really need to hold in our heads is that despite the progress that we have seen since we first launched this back in 2019, women hold only 1 in 4 leadership positions globally. Fewer than 10% of major European companies are led by women CEOs. So that gives you a sense of what we're looking at and why. And Sharon, let me get straight to you and bring you in here, because some of the people joining us today will be familiar with the 3 Barriers model. But for those who are new to it, tell us exactly what we're talking about when we talk about the 3 barriers and why they matter.
Yeah, sure. So we look at gender equity through 3 interconnected lenses: societal, organisational and personal barriers. And within our model, there are 17 sub-barriers that sit underneath these 3 broader categories. So let me go through each category in turn. Societal barriers. Now, these are the gendered norms, the roles, the expectations that shape us long before we reach the workplace. They are subtle, they're often unspoken. They are the cues and references, the messages that we all receive over the course of our lifetime, which reinforce the ways in which different genders ought to behave. So a really good example, just to bring this to life, is the gender stereotype that men take charge and women take care. So in other words, men are expected to be decisive leaders and women are expected to be nurturers and carers. So that's the societal barriers. Let's have a look at the organisational barriers. These are the systems, the processes, the workplace cultures that create an uneven access to opportunities once women are in the workforce. So some of these are systemic. So in other words, they're the structural and institutional barriers that are kind of embedded, whether it be in policies, procedures, organisational practices. So things like women not getting equal access to critical development opportunities and projects, or not getting equal access to powerful networks. So they're examples of systemic organisational barriers. And then there are cultural organisational barriers. So these are the norms that disadvantage women, such as the culture that we so often see in big corporates, which is the always on or always available culture of needing to be available 24/7. Then we come to the personal barriers, the third category. So these barriers aren't about women lacking confidence or ambition, but it's about the toll on women of navigating workplaces that are not designed for them, where women are penalised whether they conform to leadership norms or whether they resist traditional leadership norms. So women's behaviours are often shaped by societal and the workplace norms, so the other two categories, which are reinforcing gender stereotypes, and that leads to women internalising those. So personal barriers are things like reticence to put yourself forward for a high-profile assignment because you're worried about what will happen if you don't succeed. It might be a hesitancy to push for more visibility during meetings because, again, you're worried about how you might be perceived if you do that. Will you come across as too pushy or aggressive? It might be the challenges of balancing paid and unpaid work, which we'll talk about more in a moment. So if I can take a really specific example of personal barriers that women face, and that's the likability penalty. So research shows that leadership traits, so things like assertiveness, decisiveness, are still strongly coded as male. So women are expected to be warm and collaborative and accommodating, but when they demonstrate the very behaviours that signal leadership competence, they often face a backlash for doing that because they're acting outside of gender stereotypes. So an assertive man is seen as confident, but an assertive woman is seen as bossy or aggressive or difficult. So in other words, she's penalised for not conforming to those gender expectations. So it's a classic double bind. Women are expected to be likable and competent, but often they're seen as mutually exclusive. So it can force women into this impossible choice of, do I want to be liked or do I want to be respected? Because it's really hard sometimes to be both.
Thank you. That is super clear. And thank you. And I work with this model every day, but I still think it's absolutely cracking and it really has a clarity to it. And tell us, before I invite Priscila to say a little bit more about some of this, why does it matter understanding these barriers, identifying them, Sharon?
Yeah, well, I think it matters a lot to understand these barriers and get to the root causes of gender inequality, because it helps us to be more targeted in coming up with solutions. You know, this is hard. This is not easy to solve. There are a lot of barriers that are invisible to the naked eye that you don't often know about consciously. And if you don't start to narrow down on the ones that are most at play in your organization, it's very hard to solve. It's very hard to unpick it. So they're all interconnected, but if you can focus on 2 or 3 sub-barriers that are the most prevalent in your organization, then you can start to make really meaningful, really tangible progress.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just going to pause for a minute and say hello to people in the chat. Hello to Marina and Julia, Kruti, Jess, Helen, Isabel, Jake, Els. Thank you so much. Oh, someone in Western Australia. Fantastic. Austria. What an international chat we are today. It's great to have you in the chat. And just to say, towards the end of the session, we're going to have about a half hour today. It might go on. It might trip over a little bit longer than that, but do let us know what resonates. Put in any questions. I'll be keeping an eye on that, and we'll make some time at the end if needed to answer your questions. There'll also be a chance to get your hands on this report, so do stick around for that. But great to have you with us. So let me turn to you now, Priscila. We'll talk a little bit maybe about, I hesitate to say it, but gender equity fatigue. There is a sense sometimes that people say, well, gender equity, we've kind of been there, done that, not a problem anymore. And some organizations feel like we've done the work, we're all a bit over it. So what's your take on that?
Right. So it's understandable why they would think that way, because we do talk a lot about gender, and more than we have ever done historically. But the issue here is that patriarchal norms, they have been around for thousands and thousands of years. So the fact that we have made progress in the last century is just not enough. There is a lot for us to do to reform that system. So just to give an example, when I was doing my PhD, one school of thought is that if you wanted to get this right, we needed to come from a perspective that equality starts from home. So I really wanted to take that on board and have the lived experience. So I agreed with my husband, and he was happy to do that, of course, that he would stay with my daughter for 3 years doing a sabbatical and having a sabbatical, and I would work. And that was an amazing experience. And I was exactly writing that chapter, and I thought that I was nailing it, until one day that everything changed. So we had a situation where my daughter, we had a letter from school, and in the letter was saying that she needs to bring to school an orange, a fruit, right? An orange. But for some reason, my husband and I, we read that she needs to be dressed up like an orange. Honestly, I don't know how, but this poor child, we dress her like an orange and we walk her to school. And as we're getting to school, my husband start looking around and saying, something is not right here, Priscilla. And I was in my denial, wanting to have the fun, thinking, no, maybe the parents, they just didn't receive the letter. Or maybe they didn't read the letter properly because we did. And then he said, no, no, just wait here. So we're there behind a car, kind of waiting for him to go and speak to the teacher. And then he came back and said, yeah, we got it wrong. He scooped her up, took her home, got her changed, and then brought her back to school. And then he said, when we came back, by the way, I'm firing you. I said, what do you mean you're firing me? Firing me for what? And then, of course, kind of trying to control my Brazilian temper and kind of say, okay, let's just be proper British here with him and say, okay, darling, tell me more. What is happening? Tell me, what else do I supervise you with? And why did I ask this question? Honestly, the list went on and on and on. And then I realized I was just writing about gender roles. I was just writing about maternal gatekeeping and the importance of embracing that. And yet I realized that I was really holding on to a lot of the traditions. So, what that means to organizations, one problem for organizations is to kind of reach gender parity. Another one is to maintain it. I like to use the example like a bucket that you are trying to fill with water, but there are lots of holes in this bucket. And we are the holes. And we bring to the organizations these traditions with us. So as soon as you stop filling up with the water, you see the level going down. So one problem really is about maintaining it. If you don't maintain, we regress it because there is a lot to be undone, if you like. And even for me, I was writing about this stuff, right? And it still got completely wrong. It was a very enlightening experience, very traumatic for my daughter, bless her. She's probably still doing therapy over this. But for me, it was very enlightening and very interesting because it changed how I saw things and how we all contribute to that. But we also know that gender equity is good, right? It's good for people, planet, profit. There is a study from the Peterson Institute that looked at almost 22,000 listed companies across the globe and was able to establish the positive correlation between gender participation in corporate leadership and profitability. So we know that this stuff is good and it's good for everyone. But there is one last point that I want to make. It's to do with the ideal worker. So when we work with gender equity, particularly in the employment context, what we are trying to do, we are trying to dismantle the ideal worker concept, the traditional ideal worker. And when you think about ideal worker, traditionally, they have been men that they're able to devote themselves to work because they had someone else doing everything else outside of work. But the reality is a lot of men, they are not the ideal workers anymore. A lot of men, they have aging parents, they have got partners working full time, they need or they want to be part of caring, they are disabled and they need adjustment. So what is happening is we have got this pool of people that they can devote themselves to work and they're shrinking, and organizations, they keep kind of rewarding these people and putting them in positions where they have a lot of resources and they are making decisions that is impacting all of us, but their lived experiences actually they don't reflect the reality. So we end up having a lot of mismatches in terms of working systems, products and services that actually is not fit for purpose because you're kind of using your own lived experience that is not the reality. So the answer is, I know that there is this sense of fatigue, but there is a long way to go. And I think that we all can contribute to kind of reform the system. But organizations, as soon as they stop working with gender equity, they will see that regressing because we all going to kind of influence by bringing some of these traditions to work.
Yeah, thank you. And that's a great place to jump off actually about how we as individuals or leaders contribute and how our organizations can make a difference. So Sharon, I'd love to kind of dive into the model a little bit more. And if we start with the societal barrier, we can explore some of that. And I know that each barrier, there are 3, has lots of sub barriers, lots that sit underneath it. So which of those with the societal lens feels most persistent right now?
Yeah, so I think the expectation that women are primary caregivers is still really significant in society. And it plays out very clearly in the home. So in Europe and the US, women currently spend 16% of their day on unpaid care and domestic work. So it's about 3.8 hours for women versus 2.1 hours for men. So there's quite a difference between the two. And this is, of course, in heterosexual households. So if you aggregate that up globally, 708 million women are excluded from the labour force because of these responsibilities around unpaid care. So whether that be for dependent children or whether it be caring for elders or other family members. And then when you look at what impact that has on the workforce for those that are in the workforce, our research has found that 39% of women say caregiving responsibilities have limited their career progression. So it's over a third of women are saying this is having a negative impact on their career progression. And Black women have more care responsibilities than white women. And this is important because here you can start to see the impacts of intersectionality, where these barriers are greater, in this case, for Black women than for white women. We know that not all women have the same experience. Of course, for some, sadly, the barriers are experienced much more intensely. And so all of this kind of a primary caregiving expectation that society has creates this double burden for women, the double burden of your paid work, your job, and the unpaid work that you're doing as well, particularly around family and caring, but also around domestic responsibilities generally. And so this is a real problem for organizations, because what it means is they're not accessing their full talent pool. Some of that talent pool is invisible. What it can do is it can create this pattern of self-deselection where women just either opt out of the leadership pipeline or they end up working beneath their potential because they can't see how they can meet this concept that Priscila was talking about, the ideal worker concept. Which is this standard of constantly being available. It's the saying, work like you don't have a family, that kind of approach. So they think, how am I ever going to do that? So maybe I just won't put myself forward for that leadership role. And so one of the things we do with our clients is we work with them to pinpoint the places where either women are opting out or working beneath their potential in the pipeline, so that we can help our clients to address this and really shine a light on where their talent are.
Yeah, and we should say at this point, this isn't just a kind of women's issue. This impacts men as well.
Yeah, and this is a really important point. This primary caregiving kind of stereotype, societal expectation doesn't just impact women. In heterosexual relationships, at least, it forces men into the primary breadwinning expectation, which not everyone wants, frankly. Many men today want to be active caregivers, but they face a stigma for wanting to do that. So interestingly, there's some research that shows that almost half of fathers in the UK, 47%, want a less demanding job to balance their family life. Almost half of fathers, and 48% of fathers would accept a pay cut for better work-life balance. So these gender stereotypes really don't work for anyone.
Yeah. And I guess I'm curious, given that we've started by saying these are societal barriers, so there's a very big ingrained picture here in our culture as much as anything. So what can organizations do about this?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really important question, because there are things that organizations can and should do about this. Organizations have a role in helping to dismantle these outdated gender stereotypes. And I think it starts with recognizing and supporting the needs of modern families. So dual career households, single parent households, the sandwich generation, those that are supporting both dependent children and aging parents. And it's all about helping working parents of all genders, men, women, non-binary employees, to make choices about what works for them. And so the more that we can normalize caregiving for all genders, the more we start to dismantle these gender stereotypes and dismantle this idea that caregiving is primarily the domain of women. So let me kind of share some tips for organizations and also individual leaders. So at an organizational level, we always say, look at making flexible working the default, not something you have to request, not something you have to put together a case for, but the default position that all roles can be done flexibly, and yes, there might be a few that you ring fence that genuinely can't, but start with that as the default approach and normalize it for men. So normalize part-time roles, normalize job sharing roles, particularly at a leadership level. Get men role modeling that as well. That's a great way to start to bust some of these gender stereotypes. The other thing is to equalise parental leave policies. Make sure they're non-discriminatory, equalise them and normalise their uptake at all levels. Get senior male leaders to take parental leave and to do that loudly and proudly. And the other thing that we're starting to see happening across some parts of Europe is the right to disconnect. So implement policies around the right to disconnect to try and break this always on culture.
Yeah. And individual leaders, what can they do, especially those who maybe have caregiving responsibilities? You talked about modeling behaviours.
Yeah, so let me give you a really simple tip that every leader can and should do, which is just be mindful about how you might infringe on personal time. So don't schedule meetings at times that might clash with caregiving responsibilities or personal responsibilities for that matter. I'm going to give you an example, a real client story that was shared with us. A client was telling us how her line manager had requested a Monday morning early meeting, 8 o'clock every Monday, once a week for the whole team. It's a bit of a check-in to start the week. Now that created some childcare problems for her because she couldn't drop her daughter off at nursery in time to then physically get in the office for 8 o'clock. She was going to be 15 minutes late because the nursery didn't open in time. So she asked, can we either start 15 minutes late or can I dial in for that? To which the answer was no. And as a result, she had to then find another secondary childcare provision just for this Monday meeting, just for the sake of 15 minutes. It cost her an extra £90 a week to do this because her manager said no. So kind of the long story short, don't be that person. Have a think about the impact of your actions. And particularly when you're working across time zones, if you're scheduling meetings across time zones, someone usually ends up with the raw end of things. So be mindful of whether you're infringing on the school run or personal time for that person.
Brilliant. Thanks, Sharon. So we talked a little bit there about societal barriers. I know there are so many more we could talk about, but we'll move on to organizational barriers. And Priscila, I know you're going to be great on this. So what are we talking about here? What do organizational barriers look like in practice?
Right. So as Sharon mentioned, we have got two types of organizational barriers. So the systemic ones, so those are kind of the gender bias baked in your working systems and working ways that will probably give less access to women in relation to their career development and career advancement. But also you have the cultural ones. So that's kind of based on gender assumptions and stereotypes that will influence how we treat each other in relation to gender in the workplace. So there are many sub-barriers within the organizational barriers, but we have picked two because we talk a lot with our clients about those two barriers. So the first one will be about unequal mentoring and sponsorship, and then we'll talk about ambition as well in a minute. So as you can see here, 27% of women report unequal access to sponsorship, and for Black women, that increased to 33%. So let's just kind of understand what is a sponsorship first. And I'm going to ask you the permission to kind of focus on sponsorship here. So sponsorship is when someone is willing to tap into their social capital to advance or advocate for someone. It does not need to be formal. Every time we're in a meeting or we're talking to someone and they're advocating for someone, they are sponsoring someone. So why sponsorship is so important? From our experience in the working with our clients, we noticed that sponsorship predicts more promotion than actual performance. So that's one point. The second point is that sponsorship has got very real power to counteract some of the implications of networking. So let's just pause for a second here and think about networking. So networking, different than sponsorship, is about you developing your social capital and recruiting people that would help you with your career, for example, in the career context. But to be able to do that, there are so many different things that you need. You need networking skills, even if you have networking skills, then you need to access the networks. And a lot of these networks, they're very closed, particularly for marginalized groups, because they're the out groups. They tend to be the out groups. But even if you do have these skills and access, then you need to have availability or even wanting to be part of the networks, right? And a lot of these networks, they're happening outside working hours. I was doing a listening circle not long ago, and one of the participants said something that really stayed with me. And they said, Priscila, imagine that you were from an ethnic minority and you are working in an environment that's very white-centered, and you feel that you need to code switch a lot to be able to be in that environment. After you work all day and you're exhausted, do you really want to be hanging out with these people? Or do you want to go back to your communities where you feel that you can connect, where you feel that you can be yourself? So when you're thinking about networking, super problematic. I'm not saying that we should stop networking, but what I'm saying is sponsorship play a super important role in trying to mitigate some of the risks in relation to networking. So I'm thinking about recommendations and what we do with our clients. So it's not unusual that some clients, they will come to us and ask help for us to establish some networking programs. And the first thing that we do say is having networking just for women sometimes can give you that false sense of security, because you think that you're doing networking and you're doing sponsorship, and that's going to kind of promote women. But actually what you're not paying attention is to all informal networking and informal sponsorship that's happening for men. So when you're looking at ratios in terms of promotion, is it still benefiting men over women, because you're not taking into consideration the informal sponsorship. So what the first suggestion is, make everything formal. Because once you make everything formal for everyone, you can stress test for bias. You can make sure that to analyze the data to see if you have any preferences. So that's one point. The second point is about making sure that it is sponsorship is linked to your promotions and to your talent processes as a feeder pool, because then you can make sure that that's translating to actual appointments. And also, if you have got then leaders trying to promote someone informally, you can encourage them to kind of, oh, that's great, should we profile this person and put that person through the formal process? Because as soon as it's formal, you can do a lot of analysis and understand what, if there are any preferences there. And then from a leader point of view, I think that's one of the things that I have been working with leaders, is just really coaching them to think, okay, who are the last 3 people that you sponsored recently? Who are they? Are they men? Are they women? They look like you? They talk like you? They have the same strengths than you? So we all can do that personally, right? So that is about sponsorship. So let's move on now to ambition.
Yeah.
So there is this assumption that women, they are less ambitious than men. And here we have got some stats here to show that actually that's not the case. In fact, we had primary data showing that 70% of midlife women want to progress, and Black women, they are 3 times more likely than white women to aspire to senior roles, but twice as likely to be blocked from reaching them. So the implication about ambition here is that we all have been trained, as Sharon mentioned before, to see ambition almost like as a male trait. Right? So when we say to someone, is this person ambitious? We want to see things, yes, they are career driven because they work all the hours. They prioritize work over everything. And that is what is showing that someone is ambitious. But that doesn't work for many people, particularly for women in marginalized genders. But another problem as well is how we associate ambition to male traits. Because women, and Sharon mentioned that earlier, in order to comply with gender norms, might use different ways of showing that they're ambitious. They might talk about impact. They might talk about collaboration. Right, so they will sound different. So when we work with clients, one of the things that we suggest is to de-bias their processes. So we really look at the leadership frameworks, talent frameworks, and we try to find these terminologies that they have a lot of male coding, and we try to replace them with more helpful coding that would be more gender neutral, or not gender neutral, but expanding the concept. So now we have different expressions of ambition, right? So it's very interesting because once again, you can coach leaders and help them to understand in terms of their assumptions. And that's, what is your assumption?
Yeah.
If you are, can you be devoted to work, but be devoted to home as well? How does that, how does world will look if we have got both?
Yeah.
And you can really stretch them to expand as opposed to be very narrow in the way that they look at ambition.
Yeah. Thank you, Priscilla. Gosh, there's so much I'd love to spend time on, but I'm keeping an eye on the time. We've probably got about another 10 minutes or so, because I want to let this breathe, because we've talked a little bit about organisational barriers, societal barriers, and Sharon, it's important that we talk about the third barrier and the recent research and all the great juicy content that we've been coming up with here. This is personal barriers. So where do they come into play in all of this?
So as a reminder, the personal barriers are not a deficit in women. They represent the toll and the consequences of navigating workplaces that are sometimes tilted against women. And one of the most talked about personal barriers is the confidence gap. But it's not a gap in women themselves, it's a gap in how they're evaluated. So women are very often judged on performance, while men are often judged on potential. So some women find that they're subject to what we call the prove it again bias of having to provide repeated evidence of their capability. And of course, that double standard alone can shake anyone's confidence. In our research, we found that over half of women perceive confidence as a barrier. So not necessarily that they feel less confident, but they're hyper aware of how they come across, how that might be perceived, and kind of the risks of getting it wrong. They're worried about how they come across in meetings. They're worried about the consequences of asking for a salary increase and being unsuccessful, because there's a judgment associated with each of these things. Now, we found this differs according to different women. So again, here we bring in intersectionality. So we found 51% of white women face this as a barrier, but look at how it goes up when you layer in intersectionality. It goes up to 58% for Asian women, 61% for Black women, 63% for disabled women. And in fact, disabled women face some of the toughest barriers of all groups of women in our research. So this issue of women's perceived confidence, as perhaps it's better called, exists for somewhere between half and 2/3 of your women employees. So that's a huge proportion of your workforce. And if you think about it, it's not easy to navigate a system that wasn't specifically designed with you in mind. And women are often experiencing these constant contradictions. If they conform to gender norms, they're seen as not strong enough. But if they adapt the traditional leadership archetype, assertive, dominant, decisive, then they're seen as too aggressive or too dominant or unlikable. So it's a double bind that really takes a toll on confidence and well-being. And this isn't about women needing to be fixed at all. It's about changing the norms of what a leader looks and sounds like and how we recognize that in organizations and in society generally.
Yeah.
So
I'm going to get you in a minute. Sorry, Sharon, I'm just thinking about questions. So I know I'm going to invite you to talk a little bit about what we do about that. But in the meantime, I just want to flag, we will have a bit of time if people want it for questions, but now is the time to drop those in. Even if you've got to drop off, I know a few people do, because we can also reply to things. If you drop them in the chat, we can address things. So yeah, if you've got questions, if there's things you want to know a little bit more about, we will make a bit of time in a moment. So now's the moment to drop that in the chat and I'll keep an eye. But Sharon, sorry, I interrupted you think about, you've laid out the stall there, but personal barriers, what can organizations, what can individual leaders do about that?
Yeah, and organizations do have a role to play in addressing personal barriers, and absolutely there are things that organizations can and should do. So if we look at it from a systemic level, first of all, it's about redefining your definition of leadership at an organizational level. So what we recruit, develop, and promote should include traits around empathy, collaboration, inclusion. It should allow for leaders who work part-time. It should allow for leaders who are in job share roles. And by the way, this is one of the things we look for when we do audits for our clients. We look at their policies and practices. To what degree are their definitions and systems inadvertently reinforcing outdated gender stereotypes around leadership and how it's defined? Another thing organizations can do is you can train and develop your leaders and managers to recognize how bias shapes the way we view the world and how it shapes how we view confidence. So we can start to view expressions of confidence in all their forms. You can look at making sure that you are celebrating diverse leadership role models to demonstrate that effective leadership can look and feel very different. And finally, one thing I would add for organizations is you can create reflective spaces, safe spaces such as group coaching or peer learning circles where women can share their experiences to help navigate these contradictions and help build confidence collectively.
Yeah. And at an individual level, are there things that people can do and we can do when we go back into our offices today?
Yeah, let me leave you with 2 tips for individual leaders. So one of the most powerful things that you can do is to critically look at and review the feedback that you give. So both formal feedback like performance reviews and informal feedback that you might give in the moment. So is the same behavior for a man and a woman described the same way, or is it described differently? Are you using different words? Are you using different language? That will give you some clue as to how you're interpreting that behavior. And the second thing you can do if you're chairing a meeting or when you're chairing a meeting, invite women to speak if a woman hasn't spoken up, and also monitor how airtime is distributed. It doesn't need to be perfectly equal, but it needs to be fairly distributed. And there's a lot of tech that can help you to do that.
Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you. We're nothing if not practical. And really, you know, we have done, I know at Shape Talent, a lot of work around investigating, researching. We're very data driven, but then we marry that up with the practical recommendations, the specific things that you and your organization can do. Let me, while I'm just checking in the chat, now is the moment. If you have a question for Priscila or Sharon, put that in. But just let me pause while I give people a moment to do that in case there are any questions, just to say you can get your hands on this 3rd edition of our updated 3 barriers report, and you can do it in the following way. I think we've got a slide that we can put up which gives you a QR code. Magic, look at that. If you scan that QR code, you can download the paper. As you can see, we've given you the tip of the iceberg. It's such interesting and valuable and actionable data in there, so do grab your copy. There's also our website, you can visit that there. We'll drop that into the chat as well. If you haven't got a moment to get your phone, you can just follow the link and get your hands on it that way. And of course, if you would like to have a further conversation with Sharon or with Priscila and help with diagnosing, dismantling some of those barriers in your organization. You heard Sharon and Priscila talk about things like our debias audit. You talk about things like coaching and sponsorship programs. If that's something that has sparked your interest, then please do connect with them on LinkedIn, because you can absolutely find some time to talk about how we might help you. Now, I can see a question has come in from Rebecca. Thanks, Rebecca. Have the ambition, have the confidence, have the capability, but still women are not getting into visible leadership roles. What role do quotas have for gender balance on boards and or senior exec teams? Are they a necessary evil or counterproductive? So a sense from Rebecca that even when you've got all these things in place, women's not necessarily getting the roles they want. So is it time for quotas? I know this is always a controversial one. Sharon, Priscila, I can see you look ready to come in there, Sharon, and Priscila, you can dive in as well if you wish to.
Yeah, look, it's a great question, Rebecca, and it is controversial and different people have different views on this. So let me share my view on this. First of all, let's distinguish between quotas and targets, aspirational targets. Quotas largely are illegal, which is kind of filling roles to achieve a target. Targets are aspirational. There isn't, you're still recruiting on merit for those roles. So I think what you mean is targets, not quotas here. My personal view, and this has changed over the years, I used to be very anti-targets. My personal view is they work. So if you look at the research, if you look at the countries that have implemented targets, they have grown their representation of women in leadership faster than other countries. So I think whether we like them or don't like them, there is a role to play in terms of equaling the playing field, leveling the playing field. It might not be the most perfect measure, and it does need to be supported by really strong positioning and other activities. It cannot be the only thing you do. If you're not addressing some of the other systemic barriers, if you're not working on the culture, if you don't have a leadership team that is publicly supportive of this, then actually it can backfire quite spectacularly. So it's got to have other things to support it, but I do think it's part of the solution. Priscila, I don't know if you would have a different view on that.
Yes, and even if we do think about countries where quotas is kind of legal and is expected, there are arguments for both. Once again, can it be helpful and cannot be helpful, depends on where you are. In the UK, as Sharon said, you were not allowed to introduce quotas, but you're allowed to have targets. And many countries as well, quotas is not legal. But we have got some very interesting case studies, like Spain, for example, that they have progressed with quotas. So it's I personally like them because I think that is easier to hold people accountable, and kind of if you're not getting there, you kind of you're able to understand why, but it's kind of not using it to cause division, or because that's the problem with gender, right? When we work within organizations, what we don't want to do is to kind of create that division between men and women and marginalized genders. You want to kind of create more an argument and a narrative that we're all trying to do something that's good for everyone. So if you present that in a way that's not competitive, that's kind of one group is feeling that they're not going to be left behind or they're going to be disadvantaged, probably something that you need to think about in terms of managing the risk. Another thing that's interesting as well, and as Sharon mentioned, when you're looking at aspirational targets, the only thing that I would say, and we work with the clients actually setting them, because we call is a modeling that we do in terms of gender proportionality principle, that some organizations, they will say, oh, actually I have got a great target here, and they are very brave and they publish that internally and externally, but it's not realistic, because in the end of the day you need people leaving for you to be able to appoint women within that roles. So you need to do that more methodological. You need to think about the methods, how you're coming up with these targets. So if you do decide to have targets where quotas is not required, just think about how you're doing that. So you have realistic targets, because otherwise can come across as you're being very performative, and that was kind of one of the main criticisms about targets. And yeah.
Fascinating. Thank you. Really great insights. We've got, thanks, Eleanor, saying, I've heard of quotas targets being linked to the leader's KPI. Interesting. I think we've got time for one more question on this live call. Of course, if we don't get to your question, we will pick it up with you in the chat afterwards. But Jaga has got a great question here. In my previous company, she says, women were getting the roles, but there was no support moving forward. Most of them didn't want to stay in the roles due to the toxicity of the environment, where they still remain the minority. So Jaga's question is, what can leaders do to support new female leaders in their organization? We're back to this kind of pipeline, aren't we, Sharon? The idea that it's all well and good to put people in, but you don't just sort of throw them in at the deep end and go, job done, off you go. You said you wanted the role, now you're on your own.
Yeah, I mean, it's my heart just sinks when I hear these stories, because of course it does happen, and we come across organizations all the time where this is happening. And, you know, it goes back to the point that you can't just do one thing. There's no one single intervention that will address this. If the culture is toxic to certain groups of people, to women, then actually the culture needs to be addressed. So there's lots of ways in which organizations need to do that. It starts by acknowledging it. It starts by kind of recognizing that it's happening. It starts by asking the views and perspectives of women in the organization. What are the challenges that they're facing? Let's hear their voices, what's going on for them. You need a willingness at leadership level to address change. You need to pinpoint where it's happening. Where is it showing up? Is it in networking events? Is it in meetings? Is it in the promotion process? Where is it going on? You need to engage line leaders, who are the ones where most people experience culture through their line leader and immediate team. So line leaders have a huge role to play in perpetuating culture, the right culture or the wrong culture. So how do you support line leaders to be inclusive, to lead in an inclusive way, to help support people that are feeling marginalized in the organization? So there's lots that needs to be done to support cultural change here. One obvious thing that an organization can do is a bit of a diagnostic to pinpoint where this is happening. So is it at certain levels? Is it in certain departments, certain functions, certain locations? Where's it going on? So you know where to start. out your interventions.
Brilliant. Thank you. Let's keep this conversation going. We must wrap up for today, but some really interesting comments coming in. As I say, thank you to Eleanor, to Els, has given us some perspective from other countries, which is really interesting. Please do reach out to Sharon and Priscilla if you want to pick this up further. Don't forget to download your copy of the report. That link is in the chat waiting for you. If you're watching on playback, there was the QR code as well. We're always delighted to pick this up with you. And if you want help in your organisation, reach out to us here at Shape Talent. In the meantime, we won't see you until January. December, I think we're taking a break from our LinkedIn Lives. We know everybody gets into the mulled wine and the mince pies. They don't have time to get on LinkedIn so much, but we will very much look forward to seeing you in January. So look out for our LinkedIn Live in the new year. We'll be promoting the theme of that. And of course, if there are things that you want us to tackle, then do let us know what is on your mind. What are the problems that you're and the challenges that you're facing? Because we would be delighted to pick those up with you. And if you miss us in December, don't forget there are plenty of these stored away, because we meet monthly and we record these sessions. We've done things on allyship, on menopause, on AI, on flexible working parents and carers. There's a whole library of these brilliant Breaking Barriers LinkedIn Lives for you. So don't feel lonely. You can catch up on ones you missed, and we'll look forward to seeing you in 2026 to keep this conversation going. Thank you so much. Great to see you all. Cheerio. Thanks, Sharon. Thanks, Priscilla.
Thanks, everyone.